Can you hear me?
We can, loud and clear.
So welcome and thank you for joining me today. My name is Aidona Kakouros and I'm working as a botanist and interdisciplinary ecologist with the San Francisco Bay Wildlife Society. The San Francisco Bay Wildlife Society is a not-for-profit friends group authorized by Congress to support education, interpretation, and research activities at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm excited to be here, and I hope you are too, as today I'm going to share with you knowledge and experiences of Warm Springs, a very special place, as it is the South Bay's last vernal pool grassland. I hope at the end of this virtual tour, you will be inspired to learn more and, very importantly, support the conservation efforts. So come with me and let's orient ourselves first. Warm Spring Unit is a 719 acres alkaline grassland with vernal pools located in Fremont, California, next to the bay, to the San Francisco Bay, and is managed by the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge. You can see in this map in green, it's the Don Edwards lands, and in red is our site where we're visiting today. And let's look around a little bit on the aerial map. So what do you see? To the west, we see, I hope you can see my pointer, you can see the bay. Here is the grassland, the Warm Springs grassland. And it has two distinct pastures here. When you are at the side, you can see the Mission Peak to the east. The grassland is surrounded by development on all other sides. The north boundary of Warm Springs is 880, the Nimitz Freeway, and the development to the south was here before the refuge's acquisition of Warm Springs. The development to the north is newer. And I think it's a very interesting story. It's one that demonstrates the power of our environmental laws. The buildings that you see here are part of what is called the Pacific Commons Development. The Pacific Commons Development proposal, as originally submitted, would have affected the endangered species known to reside on that land. These lands were once vernal pool grasslands. Over the years, they were almost entirely leveled for agriculture, a drag race strip, and a glider airport. Working with the Fish and Wildlife Service and other governmental agencies administering the Endangered Species Act and other environmental laws, the developer scaled down its plan and more than doubled the proposed wetland set aside. To mitigate for wetland loss, the developer also agreed to provide funds to restore vernal pool topography, hydrology, and species, and preserve land in perpetuity. So keep in mind, as we're exploring our vernal pool grassland today, that it is a mix of parcels with different history. Parts of the Warm Springs unit consist of sites with relatively low human impact, and they are the closest to pristine for this type of habitat in the South Bay, and the rest are restored lands. We can thank our environmental laws for helping save a portion of this habitat, for its unique plant and animal inhabitants, and for our future generation. Folks, only 10% of original vernal pool habitat is left in California today. So here are some quick stats to give us a better perspective of the importance of our vernal pool grassland. Warm Springs is home to an abundance of unique species. The plants and animals that live here are specially adapted to survive annual extremes of flood and drought. A lot of them are rare, or some of them are endangered. In fact, Warm Springs unit is home to 3 federally listed species and 1 state of California species of concern. Okay, so the first one, it's the Contra Costa goldfields. One such special, one of these special status species, which is Lastinia conjugens, the scientific name that you see here, is a federally endangered species. This is a very important species for the warm springs, since in the 1980s, local environmental groups discovered Contra Costa goldfields, this species, at the site and rallied to save them. Partly because of this discovery, the Fish and Wildlife Service acquired Warm Springs unit in 1992 to protect and preserve the species and others who make this habitat home. This is another listed species, which is the Vernal pool tadpole shrimp, a small crustacean, a federally endangered one. The third is the California tiger salamander, and in our area, the California tiger salamander is a federally threatened amphibian that makes it home here too. And this, the barring owl, is a California state species of concern. It is a frequent inhabitant at warm springs, previously having a good breeding population. Currently, the South Bay population of this species is in peril. We'll see and talk more about the plants and animals of warm springs during our exploration tonight. So, first of all, what is a vernal pool? What makes a vernal pool? Just as it takes certain ingredients to bake a cake, it also takes certain ingredients to make a wetland a vernal pool. Let's see how we can do this. Okay, first we need a topography of mounds and depressions. Mounded areas are typically referred as uplands. The depressions are where the water collects. Next, we need an impermeable layer in the depressions. That is, a layer that doesn't allow water to pass through or percolate, as we say. The impermeable layer can be a mineral hard pan or a clay pan dipper, or in the case of warm springs, some special string and swell clay. When our the clay in the pools at warm springs gets wet, the clay expands to form an impermeable layer that prevents the water from percolating down. Next, of course, in order to have a pool, we need some water. Yeah, I know, and it has been such a dry year, right? So obviously you need some water, and the vernal pools, I have to say, they are freshwater wetlands. We need Mediterranean climate with moderately wet winter, right, to inundate the pool. And here we have the inundated pool, but this does not make it a vernal pool unless if the sun comes and we need, again, one feature of this Mediterranean climate, a warm spring. So the California's temporary pools are vernal because of its Mediterranean climate. Vernal means on or in off-spring. Vernal pools are so named because as their winter water levels recede, many wildflowers come in and bloom. A lot of these plants are what we call vernal pool obligates, that they live only in vernal pools, and they define the vernal pool's existence too. So to call a pool vernal pool, it has to have this special community of plants. Finally, we need to bake our pool in a dry Mediterranean climate summer. Yes, the pool will dry completely along with all the annual vernal pool plants. Here we have the dry pool, right? And the cycle will continue from start again, right? So it's easy to see that life cycles in a vernal pool grassland follow seasonal conditions, right? In a nutshell, there are three distinct phases in a vernal pool grassland. The wet phase that occurs in winter towards spring, the blooming phase, which is from spring towards summer. I would say it's mostly in spring. And then the dry phase, which is from summer to fall, through fall, and until the wet weather comes. So species have adaptations to help them survive these extremes, because as you understand, nothing stays constant, right? It changes, and changes are very profound. So let's continue our exploration with a dive in the wet phase. So in the wet phase, in wet years, during winter, vernal pools fill with rain water and swarm with aquatic life. Species who live in the pools, they race against the clock to grow, mate, and lay eggs before the pools dry up. Within days of the pool inundation, species such as those pictured on this slide hatch from their eggs and cysts. Cysts were laying at the dry bottom of the pool and waiting for the right conditions to hatch. Cysts are fertilized eggs. The life cycles of the small vernal pool crustaceans and insects are characterized of many amazing facts tied to their adaptations. I would say it's like environmental science fiction or something. If you, in some cases, almost a thriller, I would say, but I would encourage you to look into this. Tonight, we do not have time to describe each one species life cycle. However, I choose to introduce you to the life cycle of a special crustacean in our vernal pool grassland, which is the vernal pool tadpole shrimp. This is an endangered crustacean endemic to California. Endemic means that it is native to and only found in a certain area. The adults are about 2 inches long. Vernal pool tadpole shrimp have a shell-like structure called carapace, compound eyes, up to 48 pairs of swimming appendages, which they also use to hug their prey. You know, and two pincer-like appendages at the end of its tail segment. Now notice the little knife-looking structure between these two tail appendages. This tells them apart from other species, okay? Here's an interesting fact. Vernal pool tadpole shrimp is often called a living fossil species because fossilized vernal pool tadpole shrimp that lived million years ago in the Cretaceous, that was the era of the dinosaurs, okay? So they looked almost exactly like the ones we see today. Wow, vernal pool tadpole shrimps were here before there were fish and never developed defenses against fish predators. So vernal pool tadpole shrimp now live only where fish do not, in temporary pools like vernal pools, okay? Vernal pool tadpole shrimp are also known as an ecosystem engineer species. Why? Because they create a bioturbation, basically producing so much messy, cloudy matter when they dig through the sediment in search of food. This reduces the amount of sunlight passing through, and this in turn reduces the plant cover and alters the ecology of their pool habitat, to their advantage, of course. Vernal pool tadpole shrimp complete the entire life cycle within the filled pools. Adults can reproduce several times within one wet season, and some adults can produce cysts. Adult vernal pool tadpole shrimp die when the pools dry out, but the cysts protect the embryo from drying out. These cysts remain at the bottom of the dry pool in a dormant phase called diapause. That's a very Greek word, by the way, until the next wet year. They are well adapted to drought, and they can live at the bottom of a dry pool for about 10 years minimum, if needed. That's extraordinary. NASA thinks also too. Have you ever heard of biomimicry? It's the design and production of materials, structures, and systems that are modeled on biological entities and processes. Here's an example. NASA is very interested in the polymers that make up the cyst of several vernal pool crustaceans. They want to learn more about the cyst's materials, given its ability to protect the embryo for such a long time, and use these findings in their space program. With suitable temperatures and rainfall, many of the cysts in the vernal pool soil will hatch, sometimes in as few as 4 days. But not all cysts will hatch at the same time. So we have asynchronous hatching. And why? Because this is an adaptation in case something bad happens or the pool dry too soon. Once they hatch, the shrimps are ready to complete their brief life cycles, and they need about 54 days, and they produce their next generation. So we need at least 54 days of inundated pool for this cycle to complete. Right, let's go to the other special species here. This is the California tiger salamander, which, as we said, it's a threatened amphibian, federally threatened amphibian. As all amphibians, it spends part of their life in the water and part on the land. Many amphibians, such as California tiger salamander, grow from an egg to a juvenile while underwater. While they are in that form, they have no lungs. Instead, they have feathery gills, as you see in the picture here. To get oxygen from the water. When they metamorphose into an adult, they acquire lungs and that get oxygen from the air. After metamorphosis, juvenile salamanders move out of the pools and emigrate in near barriers. Warm Springs, actually, it's a great site because it has a lot of barriers available very close to pools. So this reduces the amount of effort that required for these juveniles and the risk associated with this movement to get into a barrier. They spend the summer underground to conserve energy when it's hot and dry. In the past, they thought they were estivating, meaning they're lowering their metabolic rate, but this is not true. New research shows that actually they're very active underground. And they can travel as long as a mile, perhaps even more. I think there's evidence for more. And if the conditions aren't right, such as during a drought season, they will not leave their burrow. They will not go, they will not try to breed. The adults reach sexual maturity in 4 or 5 years. Eggs hatch in about 2 to 4 weeks. They need a total of at least 100 days of inundation for full metamorphosis to occur. California tiger salamanders may live as long as 30 to 40 years. And we at Warm Springs, we use it as an indicator of the ecosystem health because it's a species that uses both the pools and the uplands. Hey, do you hear all this buzzing? What's going on? Hey, we are entering, it's spring here. The water recedes in the pools and we enter the most beautiful phase of the vernal pool grassland, the blooming phase. Okay, let's go to see. We're going to explore first the vernal pools due to factors such as soil, seed bank, salinity, hydrology. Each pool contains an unpredictable array of flower combination. In this way, I will borrow the expression from Carol Whittam, which is my favorite vernal pool advocate, who says that vernal pools are like snowflakes. No two are alike. An inundation regime often dictates occurrence of plant species. Therefore, oftentimes you can see zonation or wildflower rings. Let's see first some species that prefer the weather spots, like the ones that you see now. The woolly marbles here on the far right, Psilocarpus brevissimus is a scientific name, and it looks, they look like their name is, woolly marbles, especially later in the season. This photo depicts them early in spring. Later they become even more woolly, their appearance become more woolly. They are found most often in the longest inundated areas of the pool, where they have a competitive advantage because they are an amphibious plant. Yes, I know. What is an amphibious plant? It's a plant that has two phases, a phase that grow underwater and a phase that a terrestrial phase. Okay, what's the next? That's the flat face calico. That's my favorite wildflower, by the way. This is Dauningia pulchella. And I think pulchella, it comes from, in Latin, it's a Latin one that means, I think, a doll, pretty as a doll, something like this. I think that it's a very pretty flower anyway, it's cheerful. The Dauningia, it's also a species that requires longer inundation of the pools, relatively longer inundation of the pools, and they do better in wetter years. The particular structure of the flower structure, demands some more specialized pollinators for this species. Fascinating autoecology. The one under Dauningia is the Novaricia prostrata, which is a rare species in other areas, not so rare in Warm Springs, which is very cool. And it's also found towards the deeper areas of the pool. And then I also chose to show you a very elegant and fresh bloom of the Limosella caulis, which is a type of a species of mudwort that we see at Warm Springs during the particularly wet years. All right, so when we move to the slightly drier areas, we see the star of our show, which is the Contra Costa goldfields. We also see vernal pool popcorns, the white, you see the little cute white flowers here. They look like they will pop, and hence their name. And some other native clover species, which I don't see here, but they're worthy of looking. And okay, so what is so special about our goldfields, right? Because if you've been out and hiking during spring, most likely you've seen some species of goldfields. Our Contra Costa goldfields is a species that looks from a distance perhaps very alike with other species that they're more common. But you know, the plants in the genus of Lastenia, they have some morphological characteristics that you can tell them apart. And although they look pretty much the same, they do have so many different requirements in terms of hydrology and where they grow. For example, the more common California goldfields that we see usually the uplands, right? Our Contra Costa goldfields, they are found in about 10 or 11 sites in total in California. That's all. One more reason to conserve them, right? Okay. You see, so this is one of my favorite photos, a plethora of plant species with different colors and textures from eye-popping displays, aren't they? This photo by Ritzmo is my favorite because I think it creates this feeling of awe, the same you experience at the field when you approach and you see finally the vernal pool, a vernal pool like this. And I wish you could hear all the buzzing of the numerous pollinator and the freshness of the colors and the foliage. Look at this. This is where the real gold lays, my friends. So as we move farther towards the edges of the pool, more special condition species are joining the chorus of the vernal pool species. You see, the boundaries between uplands and pools are almost, I would say, liquid. Here we see alkali milk beds, Astragalus tenaire, and which is a rare annual herb endemic to California. And it grows in both coastal and inland areas, but especially in moist places. And on the other side, you see Castileja densiflora, which is a herbaceous flowering plant with numerous common names. It's like other members of the Indian paintbrush family. It is semi-parasitic, so it's a root parasite, right? And at Warm Springs, we see this at the upland, but very close to the edges of the vernal pools. Now you see here in my photo, it co-occurs with Lastinia conjugens, the Contra Costa goldfields. Oops. And I could not live outside the critters, right? Because we are a wildlife refuge after all, right? Spring is a, oops. The spring is a very busy time at Warm Springs. Western meadowlarks fill the air with their trills, calling for mates and defending their territories. Look at their nest. This is a nest that I found in the field. They they wave it using among the grasses. Then look at this fresh grasshopper, the young, this is a baby grasshopper. Look how fresh it looks. It rests on flower of Syndromedia pungens, which is the common spikeweed. And in spring, you will see a lot of rabbits and baby rabbits and hares. But I have to stop here and pause and focus on one special species at Warm Springs, the California ground squirrel. For the vulnerable grasslands at Warm Springs, this is a keystone species because the ground squirrel construct nesting habitats for a lot of other grassland species, such as barring owls, rabbits, and of course, California tiger salamanders. They also are the #1 prey item for a lot of birds of prey. So we really try to encourage their presence and activity, burrowing activity at Warm Springs. And there are many ways to do this, so we have to manage carefully in order to ensure that they keep active and present. So the underground is a very alive thing at the grassland. We're talking about the ground squirrels in a grassland because a lot of species, they found refuge under there. And this is particularly important during the hot summer time, which we are entering now, the dry phase of the vernal pool grassland. Now the days are long, the temperatures are high, annual grasses are turned into golden brown. Yes, the clay is cracked at the bottom of the pools, and the dry salt conditions are intolerable by many species. But at Warm Springs, a second wave of bloomers show up this time of the year. Yes, these are our native warm season perennials that are growing fast and become showstoppers, I would say. Here's a small collection. So this is you can see the narrow leaf milkweed, which is the scientific name is called Asclepias fascicularis. It is present at Warm Springs, and we encourage its spread. Try to encourage it through management. The alkali mallow, which is Malvella leprosa, which is a very tolerant, drought tolerant species, and often found at the bottom of the clay bottom of the pools. You see, the common spikeweed, which is it grows continuously. You see at the bottom here, this is the saltgrass. This is a perennial warm season grass. Disticlis spicata is a scientific name, and it's one of the, it's actually the most common native grasses in our site. It is very salt tolerant, and a lot of the species, if you notice, they have they called alkali something, right? Alkali mallow, alkali heath. Sometimes the heliodrop also, it's called alkali heliodrop. It's not so. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that there is tolerant. We are in ecotonal habitat, right? We are in a place that it's between the bay and the foothills, connects these two, and it needs it has a lot of salt tolerant plants, which is great, right? You see here the crystals on the top of the leaves, of the saltgrass leaves. It has this species, has this mechanism to extrude the salt so that to reduce the osmotic pressure in their cells and avoid rupture of the membranes. Okay, and you see the alkali heath, Frankenia salina, which is our most common form, and it is native. It's why I call the bones of the vegetations at Warm Springs. It's part of the bones. And then heliodrop, seaside heliodrop, Heliodropium Corazavicum, which forms low mats of many blooms that they are brimming with pollinator activity. How cool is this? And just to show you, look at this photo. The green and yellow you see are native species, most of them. The common spikeweed that keeps growing and blooming until well into October, right? So from little plants, they keep growing and blooming until October. Look how many flowers, look here, how many flowers a plant has. And that's just one plant, right? And how many pollinators can take advantage of this. So this is a great pollinator plant. It's a pioneer species as well, and it fits our management at Warm Springs, as we'll talk later about it. So speaking of pollinators, so several great, in the recent years, we have put some effort to learn more about the pollinators on the site and the insects in general at Warm Springs. Several great naturalists with strong background on entomology have been visiting the site, recording occurrences of species. And they are recording this through iNaturalist. And Olivia, could you please put the link of the project page at the chat, at the iNaturalist project page at the chat, if you guys want to see some great photos of species at Warm Springs. COVID has delayed our efforts these past years, but we hope to go back full force soon, right? When it's safe. And look at this. This precious place is home to so many wildlife species, and I chose to show you some, but really the list is very long and the biodiversity is very high. So it's a great, Warm Springs is a great place to see many species of raptors, such as the emblematic for the Warm Springs northern harrier, as I have put here from a great photo of Michael Bolte. This species habitat requirements is exactly what Warm Springs has to offer. Then it's we have barring owl, flocks of long-billed curlew. They forage into the pasture. And I honestly, I have seen more curlews at Warm Springs. I have seen it closer to the water. But I don't know, it's like, I just see them in flocks there. It's very, very cool. Snakes are very active during the summer. There's a garter snake. Some very interesting guys like this, the old man tiger beetle, which is a beetle that we found recently at Warm Springs. It's the species in peril, and it's covered under the salt marsh recovery plan, but it was very elusive, so people haven't seen it a lot. So we saw it for 2-3 years in a row. Thanks to our naturalist friends, thank you. The black-tailed jackrabbits are very common, and this, I chose to show you the loggerhead shrike, which is rather rare species of birds in other sites, but in Warm Springs, it's pretty common, I would say. We see it very like at a regular basis. So, always sounds like a fairy tale, right? But since I showed you the beautiful, I have to share with you a secret. It takes a lot of hard work, planning, resources, and continuous effort to conserve and enhance this ecosystem. A lot of bad things stem from fragmentation of the habitat, right? Did you remember the maps we saw at the beginning? But practically speaking, because we have to get practical, right? So during the preparation of the natural resources plan for the Refuge complex, we identified 3 major threats to this ecosystem. First, I identified that the lack of large native grazers, ungulates, has deteriorating effects on the ecosystem, especially when it is paired with the dominance of invasive grasses, annual grasses, and other plant species. Invasive plant species it is. So these annual grass species, they produce so much biomass, and they alter the cycles of biomass circulation. So it is the combined effects of the lack of native grazers, invasive species, especially annual grasses, has detrimental effects on our habitat because of the accumulation of the biomass, which on top, which can encroach the pools and reduce the inundation regime, the length of the inundation, but it also does not allow germination of our native species. So all these native vernal pool species, they cannot stand patchy conditions. And the third threat we identify as the climate change. And honestly, we have been experiencing this. We have been experiencing these extremes of the weather lately. We are the scenarios that try to predict the future of how the weather will be. They are not they're not convened to one result, but there is where they convene is that we will experience a lot of extreme events. So extreme droughts, like I think we experienced this couple of years, and then extreme flooding that we got a flavor in 2017, for example. So what do we do? So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages a rotational cattle grazing program to mimic, at a certain extent, the function of the large native ungulates. Cows are attracted to the annual grasses, which they control very effectively by browsing. With careful and continuous assessment, please highlight this. Careful and continuous assessment, the small herds are moved into the unit, which is divided in 10 fields or pastures, but notice we do not grow forage for the cows intentionally, okay? So we don't use the term pasture in the traditional manner here. And we have a very robust data set, scientific data set, that proves the positive effect of grazing on this ecosystem. There is also other studies in other sites that they show that careful grazing, because we are talking about conditional grazing, can have a can be very beneficial into a system, vulnerable grassland. And here, I'll show you, this photo speaks volumes about the power of this management pool. So what you see is you see a vernal pool in bloom from above, and in the middle you see this square is a grazing exclosure. So grazing was excluded in the square area. So what do you notice? What do you see? You see only annual grasses in there, because that's what the pool will turn out to be if grazing ceases. Okay, this is after 4 or 5 years of grazing of not grazed time. Notice the surrounding. You see all these wildflowers. You see some of the bare ground, which is very important, by the way, for the function of the vernal pools. Okay, some bare ground. I think you can see. And then what else? The other solution, we use the integrated invasive species control principles to keep check with our goals and tolerance on presence of invasive species. When I say invasive species, and I would actually, the best would be to use the term target invasive species. These are species that they affect profoundly the ecology and the health of our ecosystems, okay? And these are species that they spread so fast, so much that they move all of the other species away, they displace the native species. So how we manage all this? First of all, we have to have a good plan, which we put together the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they put together a nice natural resources management plan. There they define what are the key ecological attributes, what are the key indicators of the health of these ecosystems, what are the strategy, what are the threats to the health of the ecosystem, and what will be the strategies to move ahead. Okay, and once we have this in place, at the same time, we have a very robust monitoring program, which this allows us to assess whether we reach these goals or whether we are in the right trajectory to reach the particular goals that we have set, management goals we've set. Monitoring also is extremely important, especially because of this uncertainty that climate change brings. So it gives us some power, the power of knowledge, right? And long-term data sets are very important for us to understand and adapt our management accordingly. Here comes the adaptive management. You need to have specific, clearly set goals and a good, robust monitoring program to be able to learn and then adapt your management accordingly. And that's what the service does. And so although the unit is closed to the public due to the demands of management and the presence of many sensitive species, we count on your support, on the support of the public. It is your refuge after all. You can help. And how can you help? First, learn more about this ecosystem by joining educational events and tours we have. When it will be safer, okay, from the pandemic, can become an advocate. Demand your elected officials to pay attention. It is because of the action of local environmental groups that this site is conserved today. When it is safe for all, we hold programs of volunteer service for invasive species control, trash cleanup, restoration activities such as planting. Please consider joining us. Over the years, we have hosted a lot of work parties with many wonderful, diverse participants, and they were really grateful of the impact they make, the difference they make at the end of the day. Come and become a steward of the land, please. We can do it all together. We cannot do it alone. And at the end, the ultimate goal, for me, it's important to conserve this habitat, not only for its precious habitats, see all these species and to live and thrive. We have responsibility to pass to our future generations the joy to experience this natural treasure. They have a right to watch and wonder like we do. More importantly, they have a right in hope, because warm springs can teach us a lot about restoring lands, and it become the yeast for future restoration projects. Environmental restoration might be the only viable solution for our species' well-being in the near future. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention and presence. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Aidona. That was wonderful, especially that call to action at the end. I definitely want to get out there to Warm Springs with you. Just to jump in real quick, we did have one question from the chat earlier that, if you have time to answer, was about the vernal tadpole shrimp as well as the salamander. And someone from the audience was wondering whether they are going to be affected by our long-term drought, and then as well wondering about freshwater versus saltwater, how they're able to survive, or what they normally would be living their lives in.
Right. So for the shrimp and the salamanders, thank you for the questions. They're wonderful. I didn't mention this term, the boom and bust species. So these species, they have evolved over years, and particularly the shrimp, it's a very ancient species, right? So they have evolved to adapt in fluctuation of weather, right? So their biology can make them resilient. However, under the new conditions, we don't know really how the frequency of the extreme events will affect their population. right? So they are resilient in extremes over the years. You know, you have some extremes here and there. They are very, that's how they do. Boom and bust species, they're called, right? Good years and very bad years. Like the years, like this past 2 years, we didn't even have pools that they stayed inundated for longer than 50 days, right? So this is a cutoff. So this species could not complete their cycle. And let alone, I'm pretty sure that especially this past year now, that this year we are now, I don't think salamanders would initiate any breeding anyway, because there was no rain event or a series of rain events that would trigger this emigration to the pools. And what about fresh water versus salt water, right? This is the second part. Are they able to survive? Do you mean, I wonder if you mean intrusion of salt water into fresh? I mean, because the vernal pools themselves, they are not connected. I mean, they're not filled with the bay water. However, during extreme flooding years, and we got this flavor 2017, was raining for 2 months, right? And the water raised everywhere, and the water from the bay got into some of the pools. Through this water, it came also fish, and fish and vernal pool species are not compatible. So this would be very detrimental for the. Basically, it's mostly also about, except with the fish, the timing of inundation. Because remember, we want them to stay inundated for a quite few weeks, some weeks, some months, but we don't want them to stay more than some others, right? So it's a balance. The other thing that I can think of salt water, it's about the plants, really, because if you have a depletion of the groundwater, apparently it looks like a lot of our native plants depended heavily on this groundwater available on these lowlands. But when you have extreme drought, and especially if there are many people using wells around the area, what happens is that you collapse the aquifer, and then they cannot, you have intrusion of salt water, and then this will be a big problem. I hope that I answered your question. If not, please let me know.
It looks like the explanation of flooding and the history definitely makes sense. And yes, exactly like you were saying with climate change, these are things that you and our other biologists are going to be studying those impacts.
Yeah, and I agree with global warming and the climate change in general. We should be concerned because, and again, the only thing we can do really is watch carefully and do accordingly, act accordingly. And hopefully we will have a good data set so that we will know how to respond, because you have to make projections, and it's very hard to make projections for the well-being of a species now for 50 years down in the future. Just think of it. But we're smart. We can find some solutions. I hope.
Absolutely. Does anyone else have any more questions? Feel free to put those in the chat. I will also put a few links into the chat that we have here. One is going to be for a naturalist, which I did put that other one in the chat earlier, that is specific to Warm Springs. And we definitely encourage everyone to check out iNaturalist.org, download the app. You can help biologists and botanists like Aidona by identifying and looking at some of the species that are at your local parks, in your neighborhood, in your backyard, whatever it may be. So I'll put that in the chat as well. And again, feel free to ask any more questions.
I think this is one of our newest environmental movements of our era, right? So people are, going around trying to record species.
Yes, you can be a
Another
citizen
way to
scientist.
build knowledge and try to understand how we should act or when something's going wrong in regards to the climate change question.
Yes, absolutely. And everyone else can help out by being a citizen scientist as well. Let's see. And as well, if you don't have any other questions at the moment, feel free to email us at watershedwatchers@sfbayws.org. I can pass on any questions to Aidona if you have any other specific questions about the species, about the vernal pools, or how you can get involved as well. And we definitely encourage you to check some of that out. We have some more resources for you. We also do have a coastal cleanup that you can sign up for, which I put the registration link for that as well into the chat. And I'm also going to go ahead and just show a few more events that we are going to have coming up in the next few weeks here, which we would also love for you to join us for. The coastal cleanup that I put in the chat there. We have a history and mystery as well, and a refuge rails and tales that our wonderful volunteer Larry will be giving as well if you're interested in those. Other than that, if we have no more questions, thank you all so much. And thank you to Aidona for such a wonderful presentation. I know I learned so much, and I hope all of you did as well. Thank you all so much, everyone. We really appreciate it. Hope you have a wonderful night.